It seems like everywhere you turn these days, companies are talking about their impact on the world. It can be a bit much to keep up with, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. There's just so much information out there. It's tough to know where to even begin sometimes.
And that's where, well, that's kind of what these deep dives are for, right? Trying to cut through all the noise. And today we're taking a closer look at something you might have heard of: corporate sustainability reporting.
Yeah, those ESG reports everyone's talking about.
Exactly. ESG, that stands for environmental, social, and governance. Basically, it's a company's way of telling us about, well, how they're doing on all those fronts, not just how much money they're making.
Right. It's about looking beyond just the financial bottom line. Like, what's their impact on the planet? How do they treat their employees? That kind of thing.
Right. So today we're really trying to do a few things. First, we want to understand what these reports are all about, like what's the point of them. Second, why are they becoming so important? And finally, and maybe most importantly, we want to equip you, the listener, with the tools to actually read these reports and understand what they're really saying, to be able to spot the good from the, well, not so good.
Because not all sustainability reports are created equal.
Exactly. And to help us with this, we've been digging into some really interesting material, excerpts from a lecture on corporate sustainability and reporting, which has given us, well, I'd say a pretty solid foundation for this conversation.
Yeah, some great insights in there for sure.
So before we get too deep into the weeds with these reports, maybe we should take a step back and ask, like, what are we even talking about when we say sustainability reporting? Where does this all come from?
Right, let's set the stage a bit.
So the lecture we're looking at starts by talking about something called CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility. Basically, the idea is that companies have a responsibility to, well, be good citizens, not just focus on making profits.
Right. And sustainability reporting is kind of like I guess you could say, the practical application of that
Yeah.
idea. Like, how do companies actually put CSR into action?
Exactly. It's about companies becoming more conscious of their impact, how their operations affect the environment, society, and, well, all of us, really. And then how they actually change the way they do business based on that awareness.
It's a process of first understanding your impact and then hopefully working to minimize any negative impacts and maybe even create some positive ones.
And it's not just about good intentions, right? It's about measuring, tracking data, and actually holding themselves accountable. Then they use that information to communicate with, well, anyone who's interested, really:
Mhm.
investors, customers, the public, everyone.
Transparency is a big part of it.
And this isn't just some niche thing anymore, it's really gone mainstream. The lecture mentions that back in 2020, a whopping 96% of the world's 250 largest companies were already reporting on their sustainability impact.
Yeah, that's huge. It shows just how much this whole area has grown.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that it's going beyond just being a voluntary thing that companies do if they feel like it. We're seeing more and more regulations making sustainability reporting mandatory.
Yeah, there's definitely a shift happening there.
In fact, the lecture even highlights Switzerland as an example. Since their 2023 financial year, public companies, banks, and insurance companies of a certain size, and by size, I mean they have over 500 employees, and either a balance sheet total of over 20 million Swiss francs or a turnover of over 40 million, they're legally required to report on these non-financial matters. Like, it's the law.
Wow, that's a pretty significant step.
And you can actually check out the specifics of that regulation. There's a link right here in our show notes.
I'm sure some people will find that interesting.
So it's clear that sustainability reporting is, well, kind of a big deal. But maybe we should take a closer look at these reports themselves. Like, what are they actually trying to achieve? What's their purpose? And what do they typically look like?
Right. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of it.
The lecture uses this phrase: a sustainability report gives a, quote, comprehensive overview of a company's sustainability-related activities and, well, I guess the outcomes of those activities.
It's like a snapshot of where they're at on their sustainability journey.
Exactly. So the lecture raises this really interesting question, like, what's the main goal a company has when they publish one of these reports?
Well, at its core, it's about communication. They want to tell the world about their performance on these environmental, social, and governance issues. Like, hey, look at what we're doing.
Right, but hopefully it's more than just PR, right?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Ideally, it should be about transparency, about showing both the good and the bad. And it should be about accountability, holding themselves up to a certain standard.
So let's say a company puts a lot of effort into creating a really good sustainability report. What's in it for them?
Well, a well-crafted report can tell you a lot about a company. First, It shows you what sustainability topics they think are most important, like what are they prioritizing. Then it tells you what they're actually doing about those issues, what actions they're taking, what progress they're making.
So it's a way for them to kind of shape their own narrative, but hopefully a narrative that's grounded in reality.
Exactly.
Now, if I'm someone reading one of these reports, what's the main thing I should be getting out of it?
Well, the idea is that these reports should give stakeholders, anyone who's interested, a much deeper understanding of the company's sustainability performance. They should help you answer questions like, is this company actually walking the walk when it comes to sustainability?
And the lecture mentions the importance of standardization, like having some kind of common framework for these reports. Why is that so important?
Because if every company is reporting in a completely different way, using different metrics and different language, it becomes really hard to compare them, right? It's like trying to compare apples and oranges.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are there any like set templates or standards that companies use when they're creating these reports?
There isn't one single template that everyone has to use, but there are a number of national and international reporting standards that companies are encouraged to follow.
Okay, so let's talk about those standards. The lecture actually gives us a pretty long list.
It does. There's the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI for short. Then we've got the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the UN Global Compact, which has something called a Communication on Progress, and ISO 26000, which focuses on social responsibility. And those are just a few. Each one has a slightly different focus, but they all aim to promote greater transparency and accountability.
So the OECD guidelines, those are specifically for multinational companies, right?
Exactly. They cover a wide range of issues, from human rights and labor practices to environmental protection and anti-corruption.
And the UN Global Compact, that's about, well, it's based on these 10 principles, right?
Yeah, 10 principles related to human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And companies that sign on to the Global Compact are supposed to report on their progress in implementing those principles.
Got it. So that's a lot to take in already. And then there's the IIRC, which stands for the International Integrated Reporting Council and their international framework. And then the Common Good Balance Sheet, which is part of something called the Economy for the Common Good. Wow.
It's a lot, I know. But some of these frameworks are more widely used and influential than others.
Okay, so let's focus on two of the big ones, GRI and CSRD. Let's start with GRI. What can you tell us about that?
The Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, is a really important international standard for sustainability reporting. They're an independent organization, and their goal is to provide what they call a global common language for corporate transparency. And what's really interesting is that a lot of GRI's approach is tied to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
The SDGs. Those are those 17 goals for a better world, right?
Exactly. Things like ending poverty, combating climate change, ensuring access to clean water.
Right. Okay, so GRI helps companies measure their impact against those goals.
Sort of. It's more about providing a framework for companies to think about their impact in relation to those broader sustainability challenges.
Got it. And the lecture mentions that GRI is super popular, like something like 75% of the world's largest companies use their standards.
Yeah, it's been incredibly successful. I think part of the reason for its popularity is that it strikes a good balance between being comprehensive and being user-friendly. It provides a lot of guidance and structure, but it's not so overwhelming that companies are scared off.
That makes sense. But I'm curious, are there any criticisms of GRI? Like, are there any downsides to using their standards?
Well, some people argue that the GRI standards are so broad that they can sometimes lead to, I don't know, kind of superficial reporting. Like, companies might touch on a lot of different topics, but not really go into much depth on any of them.
So it's a bit of a trade-off between breadth and depth.
Exactly. But overall, I think most people would agree that GRI's had a really positive impact on the field of sustainability reporting. It's helped to create a much greater level of transparency and accountability.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about GRI. Now let's move on to CSRD. What's the story there?
CSRD stands for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it's a new set of rules that's being implemented in the EU. It's kind of a big deal because it's making sustainability reporting mandatory for a lot of companies that operate in the EU.
So this is one of those regulations we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And it's really shaking things up. The main goal of the CSRD is to improve the quality, consistency, and comparability of sustainability reporting. It's basically trying to address some of the shortcomings of the old non-financial reporting directive, which was, well, let's just say it wasn't as robust as it could have been.
So what's different about CSRD? What are some of the key changes it's making?
One big thing is that it requires companies to report on a much wider range of ESG factors. It's not just about environmental impact anymore. It's also about social and governance issues.
Okay, give me some examples. What kind of things do companies have to report on under CSRD?
Well, they have to disclose information about their impact on climate change, their strategies for dealing with climate-related risks, their policies on human rights and labor standards, their efforts to promote diversity and inclusion, their approach to corporate governance, and a whole lot more.
Wow, that's a lot to cover.
It is. And the CSRD also introduces this really important concept called double materiality.
Double materiality. I've heard that phrase before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. What does it mean?
So traditionally, sustainability reporting has focused on how sustainability issues might affect a company's financial performance. Like, if climate change leads to more extreme weather events, that could disrupt a company's supply chain and hurt their profits, right? So that's material to the company's financial bottom line.
Right, I get that.
But double materiality goes a step further. It says that companies also need to report on how their own activities impact the world around them, regardless of whether those impacts have a direct financial impact on the company itself.
Ah, so it's a two-way street.
Exactly. So, for example, a company might have to report on its greenhouse gas emissions, even if those emissions aren't currently having a significant impact on the company's profits.
Because those emissions are still impacting the planet, and that matters.
Exactly. So, double materiality is really shifting the focus of sustainability reporting. It's saying that companies need to be accountable for their impact on the world, not just their impact on their own bottom line.
That's a really big shift.
It is. And it's going to have a huge impact on how companies approach sustainability reporting.
Okay, so CSRD has been in effect since the beginning of this year, 2024, for companies that were already subject to the old NFRD. But who exactly does CSRD apply to? It sounds like it covers a lot of companies.
It does. For EU-based companies, it applies to all large companies that meet at least two of the following criteria: more than 250 employees, a balance sheet total of over 25 million, or net turnover of over 50 million.
Okay, so basically any large company in the EU.
Pretty much. It also applies to all companies listed on EU-regulated markets, including SMEs, although there are some exceptions for microenterprises.
Okay, so even smaller companies have to comply if they're listed on a stock exchange.
Right. And it also applies to all credit institutions and insurance companies, regardless of their size.
So that's a pretty wide range of companies already.
It is. But it doesn't stop there. The CSRD also applies to certain non-EU companies.
Oh, really? So even companies that aren't based in the EU might have to comply with CSRD.
Yeah, if they have a significant presence in the EU market. So, for example, if a non-EU company has a large subsidiary in the EU, or if you have a branch in the EU that generates a lot of revenue, then they might have to comply with CSRD.
So it's not just about where a company is headquartered, it's also about where they do business.
Exactly. And that's really important because it means that the CSRD has the potential to raise sustainability standards globally.
That's a good point. It's not just about the EU, it's about setting a new global standard for sustainability reporting.
Right.
Now, the lecture gives us a really great example of a company that's doing a good job of complying with CSRD. Ørsted, a Danish energy company.
Yeah, Ørsted is a great example. They're really leading the way when it comes to sustainability reporting.
So what are they doing that's so special?
Well, first of all, they're very transparent about their impact. They've done a really thorough double materiality assessment, which means they've identified all the ways that sustainability issues affect their business and all the ways that their business affects the environment and society.
And they're not just identifying those impacts, they're actually doing something about them, right?
Exactly. They've set ambitious targets for reducing their environmental footprint and improving their social impact. And they're tracking their progress against those targets very carefully.
And they're being open about all of this in their sustainability report.
Absolutely. Their report is very comprehensive and easy to understand. And it's been verified by a third party, which gives it even more credibility.
Okay, so Ørsted is kind of like the gold standard when it comes to sustainability reporting.
They're definitely setting a high bar.
So we've talked a lot about what these sustainability reports are, what they're trying to achieve, and some of the different standards and regulations that govern them. But now I think it's time to talk about how we as individuals can actually read these reports and understand what they're really saying.
Yeah, it's great to have all this information, but it's useless if you don't know how to use it.
Exactly. So how can we go beyond just skimming the glossy pages and actually critically analyze these reports?
Well, the lecture gives us some really helpful steps to follow. The first step is to identify stakeholder priorities.
Okay, so before I even start reading the report, I should think about who this report is for. Who are the main stakeholders the company is trying to reach?
Exactly. Is it investors, customers, employees, local communities, regulators? Once you've identified the key stakeholders, you need to ask yourself whether the report is actually addressing their concerns.
So, is the company actually focusing on the things that matter most to its stakeholders?
Right. Or are they just highlighting the things that make them look good?
Like, are they talking a lot about their charitable donations but not saying anything about their labor practices?
Exactly. Another thing to look for is evidence of stakeholder engagement.
So, has the company actually consulted with its stakeholders? Have they asked them what their concerns are?
Right. Do they conduct surveys, hold town hall meetings, create opportunities for dialogue, that kind of thing?
And if they haven't done any of that, that's a red flag, right?
It could be. It might mean that the company isn't really taking stakeholder engagement seriously.
The lecture gives the example of H&M, the clothing company. They had this conscious collection that was supposed to be more sustainable, but it turned out that a lot of their claims were overstated.
Yeah, and what's even worse is that they weren't really addressing the concerns of their most important stakeholders, the garment workers who make their clothes.
Right. So they were focusing on things that sounded good, but weren't really addressing the core issues.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's step one. Identify stakeholder priorities. What's step two?
Step two is to assess the consistency of the report with the company's strategic goals.
So are they just paying lip service to sustainability, or is it actually baked into their overall business strategy?
Right. You want to see if sustainability is truly integrated into how they plan to do business in the long term.
And if it's not, that's another red flag,
Right.
right?
It could be a sign that they're not really committed to sustainability.
So what are some things to look for here?
Well, you want to see if the company's sustainability goals are aligned with its overall business objectives. For example, if a company is trying to reduce its carbon emissions, is that part of a broader strategy to become more energy efficient? Or is it just a standalone initiative?
Right. And you want to see if the company is prioritizing short-term gains over long-term sustainability.
Exactly. Are they just looking for quick wins? Or are they willing to make the tough decisions that are necessary for real, lasting change?
The lecture gives the example of ExxonMobil, the oil company. They've been talking a lot about their investments in carbon capture and storage, but at the same time, they're still heavily investing in fossil fuels.
Yeah, so their actions don't really match their words. It looks like they're trying to have it both ways.
Okay, so step two is to assess the consistency of the report with the company's strategic goals. What's step three?
Step three is to evaluate the balance and quality of the quantitative data versus the qualitative information.
Okay, so we need to look at both the numbers and the stories.
Right. Both are important, but they need to be used effectively.
So let's start with the numbers. What are some things to look for there?
Well, first of all, are the KPIs, the key performance indicators, clearly defined? Like if they're reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, do they specify whether it's in tons of CO2 equivalent?
And are they using the same metrics from year to year so you can actually track their progress?
Exactly. And are those metrics comparable to what other companies in the same industry are using?
That's a good point. You don't want to compare apples and oranges.
Right. And then if they're claiming reductions, are those reductions in absolute terms? Or are they using intensity metrics?
What are intensity metrics?
Intensity metrics are things like emissions per unit of production. So a company could reduce its emissions intensity while still increasing its overall emissions if it's producing more stuff.
Yeah, so it can be a bit misleading.
It can be. So you really have to pay attention to how the data is being presented.
Okay, so we've talked about the quantitative data. What about the qualitative information? What should we be looking for there?
Well, you want to see if the narratives the company is telling are actually supported by the data. Are they cherry-picking data to support their claims?
Right, and are the narratives clear and easy to understand? Or are they full of jargon and vague language?
Exactly. And are they providing context for the data? Are they explaining why their performance has improved or declined?
Okay, so that's step three. Evaluate the balance and quality of the quantitative data versus the qualitative information. What's step four?
Step four is all about spotting greenwashing.
Ah, greenwashing. That's when companies try to make themselves look more sustainable than they really are.
Exactly. And there are a lot of different ways they can do that.
So what are some red flags to watch out for?
Well, one big one is vague language. Like if a company says it's committed to sustainability but doesn't provide any specific details about what that means, That's a red flag.
Or if they say they're exploring sustainable solutions but haven't actually implemented anything.
Right. Another red flag is selective reporting. That's when a company highlights its positive achievements but downplays or ignores its negative impacts.
So they might talk a lot about their recycling program but not say anything about their carbon emissions.
Exactly. And another red flag is the absence of third-party verification.
So if their sustainability claims haven't been independently verified, that's a problem.
It can be. It means you have to take their claims with a grain of salt.
And finally, be wary of companies that rely too heavily on carbon offsets.
Right. Carbon offsets can be a useful tool, but they shouldn't be a company's primary strategy for addressing climate change.
Okay, so those are the 4 steps to critically analyzing sustainability reports. That's a lot to keep in mind.
It is. But it's worth the effort. Sustainability reporting is becoming increasingly important, and it's up to all of us to hold companies accountable for their impact on the world.
And that's really what this deep dive has been all about. We want to empower you, the listener, to be a more informed and engaged citizen.
Exactly. We want you to be able to read these reports and understand what they're really saying. We want you to be able to spot greenwashing and hold companies accountable for their actions.
So, the next time you see a company talking about its sustainability initiatives, don't just take their word for it. Ask questions. Dig deeper. Use the tools we've given you today to critically analyze their claims.
And remember, sustainability is everyone's responsibility. We all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable future.
Now that you have this framework for understanding sustainability reports, what will you start asking? What companies will you start looking at more closely? And how might this new understanding change your decisions as a consumer, as an investor, as a citizen? Think about it.